Okay, good morning. I hope you can hear me clearly. Thank you very, very much for joining us this morning for the final session of the conference. And it's really great to see so many people here. I'm absolutely blown away that we have a virtually full lecture theatre. So thank you. It's really, really gratifying. So we've got a number of things for you. First and foremost, I'm delighted that we have our Territory Politics Governance annual lecture. And obviously that speaks to me very strongly because my name is Klaus Dodds and I am the editor-in-chief of Territory Politics Governance. And it's a journal very, very dear to my heart. And it's clearly one that the RSA membership are very keen on, because next year we go to 10 issues and we continue to go from strength to strength. And who knows, we might even join regional studies and become monthly. That would be my ambition, but let's see what happens. So it's a great, great pleasure. I'm going to do the three introductions now, so then we can kind of move seamlessly through proceedings. And then we'll make sure we leave some time for Q&A for you, the audience, of course. And then after that, we'll just then go into the sort of the final session in terms of thank yous and goodbyes. So don't leave your seat. It will be truly seamless. And thank you again for your support. So first and foremost, let me welcome and introduce Dr. Janez Potočnik. Janez is a very, very distinguished European Union Slovene diplomat, researcher, public intellectual. One of the things I learned from Janez was that I think he can take credit for a number of things, but one of the things I felt very inspired by was to know that as part of his term within the European Union, he played a key role in helping to create the European Research Council. So for that alone, he deserves huge thanks. Now, you know perfectly well that I speak to you, if you do know me, as a third-party state citizen. So there is a certain irony in all of this, but who knows, maybe in my lifetime we'll be back. And but I don't have to labor the point. British academics do incredibly well in the European Research Council, just noting. So that's first. Janez is going to talk to us about something that I think is so topical. It's really unbelievable. The importance of natural resource management. What does a more sustainable future require? Strengthening cooperation, improving governance, and understanding the politics of systemic change. So I think we really are in a good moment to consider that. After that, I'm really delighted we'll be able to welcome Dr. Alexander Chen, who is our early career researcher, plenary speaker. Alexander is going to speak about co-creating regional and sustainable futures. And then finally, it's a huge pleasure as well to welcome Professor Virginie Mamadouh from the University of Amsterdam. And Virginie is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Territory Politics Governance. And she and I work very closely to steer the journal, and I'm very grateful for her support as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to welcome Janez up to the stage, and then after that, we'll move to Alexander and then Virginie. But thanks again, colleagues, for joining us.
Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. By the way, this was my faculty, so I was studying here. You have heard actually what my lecture will be. It will be indeed a lecture, so proper like at university should be. But before starting, I would just like to explain you what I'm currently focused on, so that you would a bit know where the scientific facts which I will be sharing are coming from. So I'm co-chairing so-called United Nations International Resource Panel. We are kind of a sister organization of more known IPCC and IPBES. IPCC dealing with climate change, IPBES dealing with the biodiversity loss, and we are there dealing with natural resource management. I will lead you later on a bit about through what are the core things. So we have approximately 40 scientists from all parts of the world. By the way, I'm just coming from Bangkok yesterday. I landed and we had the whole week discussion of the International Resource Panel in Bangkok. Then we have a steering committee, and on steering committee, it's 35 countries representatives, including European Commission. And then we have a secretariat located in Paris, relatively small, lean, but quite efficient. And we are science policy interface. So we do both science and policy, which means that this is leading us to a large extent to economics, which will be part of the story, which I will explain. We have many strategic partners, but let's leave that aside. So what are high priority areas on which we are concentrating in next period? The first one is we are, of course, looking to the global resource use and trends. So we want to evaluate what is happening in resource use. Then we are putting that in the context of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. So the triple planetary challenges which we have. Then all that into the health, well-being, prosperity, and equity story. And finally, also trade, finance, and innovation. So some are closer to policy, some are more focused, solid, research-based. Let me start now with main challenges, the diagnosis of the problem. And let me start the story in my own home country, Slovenia, with probably the most known Slovene, that's Slavoj Žižek, our philosopher. He was some years ago saying, it is clear that we are approaching the ecological and digital apocalypse, but we should not lose nerves. And he was continuing in very much his manner, everything under heaven is in utter chaos. The situation is excellent. So let me now try to explain a bit of, from the resource point of view, what that chaos actually looks like. This is the biomass of animals. So you can see here humans and wild mammals, wild birds. So you can actually see that we are pretty small part of that animal biomass. But if you go a bit further, then you can see that comparing to the rest, plants, protists, virus, archaea, fungi, we are again relatively very small part. But actually, that's not the point which I want you to remember. On the left-hand side, you see the biomass of life. So everything watered together. And on the right-hand side, it's anthropogenic biomass. That's what is created by humans. And concrete, bricks, aggregates, metals, and so on. And the estimates are that if the trends will continue like this, that in 2040, this will be tripled to the left. So already today, the plastic kingdom, it's double of the animals kingdom, including humans. So that's the reality when we look to that space. We all have learned about this donut perspective, which is a kind of compass for prosperity. In the inner circle, you have basic human needs, which are, of course, expanding. And on the outer circle, you have planetary boundaries. So safe operating space, it's green, which is, of course, shrinking. And when you look to the planetary boundaries, according to the research, this is actually the recent one which was published, but I haven't accommodated. So there are some planetary boundaries which are obviously already overstepped. And if you look it to a more national context, then you would find out that, for example, if you compare Malawi, China, Belgium, Australia, that of course there are economies, national economies, which are living in totally different conditions and overstepping planetary boundaries, some more, some less. Actually, you can summarize it in this slide here, where you have the countries on the left-hand side. Here are the countries where biophysical boundaries have not yet been transgressed, but unfortunately, also the social thresholds were not met. Then you have a group of countries which are the countries which are currently in quick development. But unfortunately, it's always like that, that you first transgress planetary boundaries and then you start actually to meet social needs. And then you have the countries where practically all high-income countries, including European countries, belong, where we are very much transgressing planetary boundaries, but on the other hand, also meeting the social thresholds. So what happened if we look a bit more together is, this is basically the Club of Rome approach, that we moved from so-called empty world, which was dominated by nature, to the full world, which is now dominated by humans. In the empty world, it was labor and infrastructure, which were the limiting factors of our human well-being, while in the full world, it is now natural resources and environmental things which are limiting factors of human well-being. That is actually telling you that even if you talk on purely economics of the future, it's about how you manage natural resources and environmental things. So one thing which we are pretty much forgetting is that we are actually the first generation ever on the planet which is living in socio-ecological space of planetary scope. Just imagine everything from internet and ChatGPT to the COVID, to climate change, when you look through security eyes, actually this global dimension came with nuclear. And now it's really global. Before it was not global, before nuclear. There were regional wars maybe which were connected, but it was not global. So, which brings me to the conclusion that our individual and collective responsibility has enormously increased of how we handle all those things. This is a nice thing which will, in a bit simplified way, tell you what, at least in economic world, it's pretty challenging thing to understand. You know that we are measuring our success in GDP, so the amount of products and services which we are putting on the markets. This is an inclusive wealth index, which has basically three components. Production capital. This is this production capital per capita. It's this dotted line. This solid line is actually GDP per capita, which means that production capital, and they are more or less synonyms. And then you have human capital. Human capital is this blue dotted line. And then finally, you have a natural capital, which is a green dotted line. In these years, which were studied, so it was a bit more than 20 years, production capital per capita has almost doubled. Human capital was more or less standstill, 8% increase, and natural capital almost 40% down, which could lead you to a relatively simple conclusion that growth of GDP in these past decades has been, to a large extent, achieved on the cost of depleting the natural capital. And that's why we are actually indebting future generations. We don't have only financial debts, we have also natural debts. So for anybody who ever studied economy, this is a really simplified story, but I've done it just that we would understand where we are. So normally we are taught that, of course, producers and consumers behave rationally, which is true. So we behave on the basis of the incentives which we are getting from the market. But incentives, but what is actually the outcome of the game? Production capital, it's overvalued. If I would connect it to the previous slide, human capital, it's undervalued. And natural capital, to a large extent, it's not valued at all. These are the signals which we are each day getting as consumers and producers. Of course, if we think that through that signals, we will reach economic, social, and environmental balance, wake up. We will not. So fundamentally, the things needs to change on incentives, which we as producers and consumers are getting through the markets. Regulation will not do the job. It will do an important part of the job. But if regulation is sending you here, market here, it's just confused producer and consumer. That's all, and a lot of lobbying, by the way, which you all know that it's part of our life. Let me now shift to the resource perspective, which, according to our science, are the common roots of the triple planetary crisis. When we say natural resources, what we actually talk about? Biomass, metals, fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals, we call it materials. So everything what we extract from Earth are materials. And then on the top of that, water and land. So when we look to the last 50 years. This is from our first report, which we call it Global Resource Outlook 2019. We are just in the final phase, and I will end my presentation of the Global Resource Outlook 24. We will come soon out with it. But what were the major conclusions? First, global material use has more than tripled in the last 50 years. It has almost doubled per capita, which means that majority of that tripling could be devoted to economic growth, but important part of that is also population growth. And finally, which is the most interesting, this solid black line, material productivity. Material productivity is the efficiency of materials per unit of GDP. It is growing in all the countries, full stop. But how it's possible that it's falling on a global level? So till the year 2000, it was growing and then started to fall. Now it's more or less standstill. It's possible because till the year, that was approximately the year when a lot of the production, a lot of the things which you are buying, which we are buying, was before produced in resource more efficient countries like Europe, like Japan, and now it's produced in less resource efficient countries. And when you summary that on a global level, that's where you come. You come to that actually per unit of GDP, we are using resources less efficiently. Which leads me now to the when we analyzed how much are environmental impacts in the value chain of extraction and processing, we came to the conclusion that we can connect that to 90% of global land-related biodiversity loss and water stress. As you can see here, majority, it's practically biomass. So if you want to stop biodiversity loss, you have to look at biomass and fix what is happening there. Later on, I will bring you to a bit different kind of approach. 50% of global climate change impacts and 1/3 of air pollution health impacts. This is not yet about consumption. It's production, it's extraction and processing. So if you buy new car, if you park it for the whole life, you have created 1/3 of the pollution. That's a kind of message which you get there, because car needs to be, resources needs to be extracted and car needs to be produced. Which leads me now to the conclusion. So if trends would continue according to our estimates, this will, the material consumption is predicted to double by 2060. So if it's anything, if we are serious about any kind of sustainability in the future, we need to decouple the growth of well-being and the growth of economics from resource use, and both from environmental impacts. Which leads me then to solutions. So that's pretty much the picture where we are and what we have to do. And the first, probably also one of most important solutions, it's linked to the circular economy, which should actually be seen as a kind of instrument, how to deliver that decoupling. Is circular economy logical and needed? Yeah, of course. The whole nature is circular economy. In nature, nothing is lost, everything has its purpose, and the real question there is just one. Do we believe that we humans are part of nature or not? So if we would answer to that question positively, then circular economy, it's a kind of logical conclusion. But I see it also, that's why I see it also as a kind of part of bigger picture of this economic, societal, if you want, cultural transformation. So if you want an economy which is aligned with European Green Deal or which is aligned with Sustainable Development Goals, that's that. Nothing, it shouldn't be linear like in many cases it's still existing. Which leads me then to, there are different layers of circular economy. The most common is this one, minimize waste and pollution recovery strategies. So many are talking, when they are talking about circular economy, about recycling. Recycling is the worst of the good. But when you recycle, of course, you have already used the resources. Yeah. And then you have higher maximize lifespan, reuse, repair, refurbish, remanufacture, and so on. Then you optimize product design, reduce strategies in manufacture and use. And finally, it's minimize product need through better system design. So refuse, rethink strategies. And these are practically nowhere on the agenda. And that is one of the real problems. So, which leads me then to a bit of different logic like we normally use in our approach. At the end of the day, we don't need cars, we need mobility as humans. We don't need light bulbs, we need light. We don't need chairs, we want to sit. We don't need refrigerators, we need chilled and healthy food. We don't need CDs, we want to listen to the music. We don't need pesticides, we need healthy plants, and I can continue and continue. So dematerialization, rethinking the ownership, which is pretty much also part of the problem. Add to efficiency policies also the sufficiency questions and policies, it's a must. Let me just try to explain you on refrigerator example. If I'm owner of refrigerator, which is today's case, then producer has only one interest, to sell me as many as possible. They are a bit competing between themselves and aligning them, but everybody who is my age knows very well that refrigerators, washing machines, and everything has much shorter lifespan than it was some years ago. So we are even incentivized that since the services for repairing, refurbishing, or whatever are so costly that we are incentivized to buy new ones. And by the way, some new technology and all goes there, which of course it's extremely resource intensive story. So if for example, the producer would be the owner, so suddenly that would not be the base for his cost, but the base for his profit, but the base for his cost. So they would be incentivized. You don't need eco-design directive anymore because the market would tell the producer that you have to design it differently. It has to be repairable. It has to be upgradable. I know that there are a lot of problems of how you would do that in practice. So don't tell me there are a lot of problems to do that, because I know that. But the real question is this logic right? And if it's right, if it's leading to the right direction, let's deal with the other problems and not kill the concept. So the main question, which is often overlooked and needs to be addressed, is this one: how to meet human needs in most energy and resource efficient way? That's the core question, which contains a lot of important messages, which I'm trying actually to depict through the whole presentation. Now, since part of the title of the lecture, it's Politics of System Change, let me present you something. It will be more or less a snapshot because I can't go through the details. So this is a teaser like for movie, so that you will take it in your hands and study it a bit more in detail. Is something which we called System Change Compass. We actually asked ourselves a simple question: what needs to be done that the European Green Deal would be implementable? Because we believe that ambition is high, that it's no doubt about that, but we also believe that implementation is uncertain. I will more unpack that part of uncertainty through the blind spots, which I will be addressing later. But of course, also the COVID-19 war in Ukraine, all that is contributing. But I will a bit look more into detail of what is systemically wrong now and what would need to be changed. And that's why we have presented the compass. The compass has 10 core principles. I will explain them, each of them, just that you would understand what those core principles are. And then we have connected those 10 core principles to each one to 3 policy measures which need to be core. So 13 total, it's there. I will just give you one example that you will see how the things are connected and how do they look. And finally, then we went to connect that policy part, so the macro story, to the real economy, to the micro story. And we asked how we would need to look into the real economy, which today it's addressed through the economic sectors. What would need to be different if we would like to make the things more sustainable? And finally, we ended with quite concrete proposals of which are the investment opportunities of the future, which are consistent with that system. So first, redefining prosperity, embracing social fairness for real prosperity. We need to move from prosperity, which is defined by aggregate economic growth, to prosperity defined by fair and social economic development and well-being for all. What would that mean? And this will be the only example which I will give you in policy orientations. First, we would need to balance policy and attention, which is currently given to the wealth creation, to income and wealth distribution. I'm not saying that we should not look to the production side also, but in particular in high-income countries, distributional aspect is as important as the production aspect. Then, because we need to, equity and social fairness, it's pretty much the name of the game. Why is this so important? Because conditions for social acceptance of the necessary transition, which I'm talking about, should be in place. If they will not be in place, you can never do environmental transition without simultaneously doing social transition. Never. Because you will always get opposition of the changes, and you see that in practice on a daily basis. So it's fundamentally important that we look the things in a combined way. And finally, this is a bit more concrete, replace part of the income-based taxes with the resource-based taxes to address resource as well as social policy targets. So if you will look in Compass, you will get 30 of that kind of recommendations. These are free. So I'm just going now to mention the other redefinitions. Redefining natural resource use. Prosperity should be decoupled from natural resource use, from prosperity based on resource-intensive production and consumption, to prosperity which is decoupled from resource consumption through efficiency, sufficiency, and the shift to responsible use of natural resources. Third, redefining progress from growing economic activities and sectors to focusing on societal needs that need to be fulfilled without transgressing planetary boundaries. Next, redefining metrics. From decisions driven by optimizing GDP growth to decisions driven by holistic well-being metrics, including natural capital and social indicators. Redefining competitiveness from massive dependency of Europe on imports of natural resources to resilient Europe based on low carbon products, services, and digital optimization. Redefining incentives from incentives which not sufficiently value human and natural capital and supporting status quo to incentives aligned with Green Deal ambitions, leading to economic, social, environmental balance and sustainability. Redefining consumption from owning products as part of individual identity to experiencing and using products and services as part of individual, shared, and collective identity. Redefining finance from subsidizing old investment in old industries to supporting and facilitating transition needs and sustainable economy of the future. Redefining governance from top-down, static, slow normative policy processes to transparent, flexible, inclusive, participatory models of governance influenced by science. And finally, redefining leadership from traditional leadership roles and expectations to system leadership based on intergenerational agreement. So that was quick, I know. And by the way, each of them have few pages of explanations, what is behind. But don't ask me which one should come first, please, because they should be done simultaneously. It's really a kind of vision of thinking what is in today's systems actually wrong that we are where we are. And then we moved, as I said, to the question of real economy. And there we are not looking to sectors anymore. We are actually looking which are the most resource-intensive human needs. Why that? Because those which are most resource-intensive are actually the reason that we have climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution. So you have also many of human needs like culture, like sport, and so on, which are not so resource-intensive and are not core in causing the climate change. But when we identify them, these are nutrition, housing, mobility, daily functional needs, so from clothing, computers, and everything what you have. And then we have identified also the systems which are enabling meeting those human needs. And typically, that's directly using nature. Then, of course, energy, which is in everything what you talk. Then materials, which is basically pretty much part of that, and innovation, digitalization, and all that connected together. So that basically should be our focus. And in the last stage, we have then identified investment opportunities. I will not absolutely go into detail, just telling you which kind of trajectories to future are consistent with that logic. And if I summarize that, system change compass, it's redefinitions, then economic ecosystems, all investment opportunities, and each of them connected to policy orientations. First on the policy level, then on a concrete ecosystem level, and finally explaining why those investments makes common sense. Which leads me now to why we are not going there and which are the main blind spots. So the first one is this: lack of holistic system approach. So public leaders and society at large simply lack capacity or knowledge how to translate system change visions into their concrete policies, investment structures, which ends in conflicting policy logic and hinder the real transformation. This is typical example. When we talk about climate change, our goal is how to meet climate change targets 2050, whatever it will cost. It's wrong, because whatever it will cost costs a lot. So the real question would need to be how to meet climate targets 2050 with minimum cost, or better to say, with benefits also for the rest of the questions which we simultaneously have to manage. So this is one typical example through which you will see. This is conclusion of the climate convention, by the way. It's saying this, that Glasgow. Road transport aiming for zero emission vehicles to be the new normal, accessible, affordable, and sustainable in all regions by 2050. My God, if this will happen, then we are really doomed. So I think that we need to understand where current logic is leading and where system change logic is leading. Let me explain you the current logic. We are optimizing sectoral output, measuring and aiming to maximize GDP, car industry, replacing combustion with electric vehicles and making them available and affordable to all, which leads on one hand to increased infrastructure land use due to economic and population growth, but it has also positive effects, maximizing value of used materials, which leads on one hand to additional roads, new charging points, additional parking spaces, which is reducing indeed pollution, but not addressing the time lost in traffic. That's the current policy which we have, also in climate change. If you would go optimizing delivery human needs, then you measure and aim to optimize well-being, reduce need for mobility, and optimize access to mobility based on reduced energy and material needs, optimized infrastructure due to human need focus, health and well-being benefits, which leads to modal shifts, higher utilization of vehicles, reduced land use, and reduced pollution and environmental impacts, and time lost in traffic. So you can easily see what is the difference of the approach and where they are, where a more system thinking is leading to these co-benefits which we need to create. Which leads me to the second, lack of drivers and pressures perspective. Policy attention, it's more on the surface. So we don't go to what is actually causing it. And predominantly, we are not linking it to the resource story, and we are not linking it to the, to the main economic drivers. If I try to explain you, this is actually IEA, that's International Energy Agency. According to their data, reaching net zero by 2050 will require about 6 times today critical mineral use, 6 times. That is on the supply side of energy. But let me look to the side which is less visible to the demand side. For example, for electric vehicles, you need close to 10 times of the materials comparing to conventional cars, which anybody who is common sane would see that this is a problem. So I'm not at all saying that we don't need energy transition, that somebody will not later say that. No, we need it desperately. But while we need it, we need to ask not also some questions which we are currently not asking. This is the question which we are asking: how to improve virgin critical raw materials supply. So it's how to make the mining more sustainable. Second question which we are asking is improving circularity directly for critical raw materials and critical raw materials including products. So it's predominantly about recycling the products which have critical raw materials. But the question which we are not asking is this: how could we actually improve circular efficiency of energy-intensive systems, which I have identified before? Because if you optimize those systems, you will need less energy and less materials, because the story in which we are currently in energy transition is this: for getting into renewable energy future, we need more materials. For that, you need more energy. For that, you need more materials. It will not end up well, sorry. So we need to ask the question how to optimize our own part of the story. Most solutions today are in pillars 1 and 2. This is Critical Raw Material Act of European Union, US strategy, G7 strategy. So it's pretty, so nobody is asking the question, and these are all the most advanced and countries which are consuming most materials, and nobody in those countries is asking the question, how can we optimize that? So too little focus on environmental impacts, missed opportunities to reduce demand through systemic circular strategies, and confusing market signals I have already mentioned. I will just mention you what we are currently doing. If you would, for example, go to the market shop, pick up what you need and leave the shop, of course, the market will get broken. That's what we are doing with nature. So we are entering, picking up, not paying, and it's getting broken. So that's, and then this sending policy one way and market signals other way, I have already explained. You can't ask consumers, it's simply not fair, at least this faculty should protest, that you ask them to buy, I don't know, more environmentally friendly things and buy double price. You are basically asking them to be stupid. It will not work like that, sorry. And the last is the lack of demand side focus. So policy attention is mainly given to supply side of the economy, to the cleaning of existing economic systems, which unfortunately it's not leading to something which in particular would address the fairness and equity question. So let me explain you here. Energy is absolutely in the center and should be in the center of attention. But if you look to fugitive emissions from energy production alone, it's not so big story. So energy use in buildings, energy use in transport, energy use in industry. So both needs to be part of the attention. How can you minimize the use of energy in those sectors? Then answers in the energy transition sector will be much easier. So in climate efforts, we are simply ignoring the question of the wastefulness of production and consumption. And this will not bring global south on board, sorry. Because if we don't look into the mirror, we will have a problem in overall getting the global society on board. So there is a nice example. If you decarbonize the steel, it's absolutely necessary and important, but if you don't ask the question, how much of that steel is actually used in underutilized cars or empty houses, why? Why we would produce that steel which has zero effect for social well-being? So sufficiency policies needs to be added, consumption footprints and material footprints should be added. So in summary, if we want to avoid extinction of elephants in nature, we must extinct elephants in our rooms. So that's basically what we need to do, or we have a problem. Which leads me to the final part, and I will be very quick here, 5 minutes max, about introducing what will we introduce in International Resource Panel in our next step. Core principles, measuring what matters, broadening measures of progress beyond GDP to capture real human well-being, balancing resource use to meet human development targets equitably for all, integrating resources into global sustainability and environmental agendas, informing decisions making through science-based, inclusive, transparent, accessible data, introducing the whole value chain approach, strengthening the institutionalization and management of resources across the value chain. There are 4 major novelties which you will see in our approach. The first one is the one which I have already explained. So looking through the provisioning systems, through human needs, which basically gives you more solutions options, like today existing. This is just a snapshot. It's not to be copied, as you can see. So what we are trying to do is now looking to climate impacts through human needs and provisions there, and looking through biodiversity impacts again. And if you look to biodiversity loss, you see that we need to fix the food system. If you don't fix the food system, biodiversity loss will never be fixed. So you will get quite a variety of data and information there. Second is, we will complement supply with demand side, connecting resource use to equity and justice related implications. It is high incomes, low income countries, but it is also high income consumers versus low income consumers inside the countries, also in low income countries. So both aspects needs to be taken into account. And this is not so important, just to show you what would that mean and how it would look. So here you have climate impacts, high income countries, upper middle income countries, for all the provisioning systems and everything that. So I guess it will be quite a revolutionary approach in all the logic and thinking. And then in the modeling on the top of two scenarios, which are already present, context scenario, it's basically analyzing the already agreed changes in the climate change policies also, while the towards sustainability prosperity scenario, we will try to model, or we have done that, we have modeled also the systemic changes and what would they bring. And I can tell you, it's quite a convincing story. And finally, we will also address the responses chapters. So how we need multilateral alignment of how to institutionalize resource use in our systems of governance, finance, trade, and across business. These are concrete things which we are there proposing, but since I know that you're already tired, I will lead you to conclusions. So, what one can conclude from what was currently said? The world has changed. When the Club of Rome releases the limits, the famous limits to growth, that was 50 years ago, it was 3.8 billion on the planet. Now we are over 8 billion. So what happened in that period? From the limits of growth, we actually entered the period of growth of limits. And it's getting worse. Global Resource Outlook will give you good scientific rationale for change. And by provisioning systems, it will also give a lot of those things which could lead us to a more just and resilient world. But to make this vision implementable, some basic shifts would be needed. I will list 4 of them. First one, from the current economy, which is basically putting humans in function of economic success, we need to move to an economy which will be in function of delivering human needs. So set the order right. And this is pretty much conflicting with some of the capitalistic logic. Second, from an economy which is currently considering humans as external and superior to nature, to an economy acknowledging that we are embedded and part of nature. Destroying nature is destroying ourselves, or we are not part of nature, which is fundamental stupidity. Third, from extraction-based production to a creation-based production, we should stop stimulating extraction-based economic success and reward responsible, innovative, creative ways of meeting human needs. And last, from an egoistic, short-term based interest governance structures and logic to cooperation and to sharing sovereignty. This is a must in the new world in which we are living. We must improve our collective resilience, and we need a convincing intergenerational agreement. So these are the core basic things, which I do believe if you want to talk about system changes that are needed. Some are saying that this is problematic perspective for business. But let me share you the 10 top risks identified by business leaders in World Economic Forum this year. Just look here. In 10 years perspective, failure to mitigate climate change, failure to climate change adaptation, natural disasters and extreme weather events, biodiversity loss and ecosystems, natural resource crisis. I don't know. They are telling us that this is coming. Business leaders. And we should simply understand it's getting green. So taking painkillers to remove the acute pain will not heal the chronic diseases. It will just hide them and put them under the carpet, make them worse, actually. The transformation, it's not only about environmental sustainability. Access and use of natural resources have been in human history always the reason for the well-being reached by the nations. Just remember access to water, land, precious materials, oil and gas, minerals, and so on. By the way, unfortunately, this access was pretty much also the reason for conflicts and wars in history. So, and the whole history of the colonialization of nature, it was actually not colonization of people, it was colonization of nature. And colonization of people was a consequence of that. It's also a central question of fairness and equity. So when we talk about future, changing our relationship with nature, or better to say with the rest of nature, it's a core imperative. Because currently, this is not stable nor balanced, and it will be resolved. I can tell you, believe me, it will be resolved either with collective wisdom and effort, or in a hard and very painful way, which are conflicts, which are pandemics, which is migration. And one can list even more than that. So we must broaden and strengthen the front of stakeholders for change to put the current challenges in a more strategic context. And I hope I have you on board. That was actually the whole purpose. So I'm ending. Why? Because all governance levels matter. And this is actually the slide which is closer to you. The cities and regions matters a lot because of two major things. One is because of the autonomy of governance. Even if there are no national agreements, even if there are no global agreements, a lot could be done if the mayor is intelligent. And the second reason is because a lot of the problems, which means solutions in brackets, are actually concentrated there. Of course, governments and international global cooperation is also needed, but indeed a lot could be done through the optic, through regional and cities optic. And this is the last slide. Finally, most important advice for what more sustainable future require from the most famous Belgian. Some are confusing him that he's French, no, he's Belgian. Actually, I'm living in Brussels majority of my time. That's why this is a good, but it's the best message to all of us. When he was asked why he's speaking about himself, always in the third person, he replied something like that. If one is such a genius like me, it is very important to establish a healthy distance to himself. So I think this is the challenge of our generation. If we think that we are so goddamn intelligent, let's establish a healthy distance towards ourselves, because this is a healthy distance which actually takes into account that we are not the last generation on this planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an extraordinary presentation, and I love that little switch from the limits to growth, the growth to growth of limits. I think that's, for me, one of the key takeaways. Thank you, Janez. So without any further ado, I'm going to invite Alexander to come and join us. And Alexander, as I said right at the start, is giving the early career researcher plenary talk. So thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Alexander Chen. I am from Roskilde University, Denmark, which is a university that was founded in 1972. It was something that arose out of the student protest in the 1960s. And it was a university based on the principles of critical pedagogy and radical politics. Now, since then, the university has departed a little bit from its critical roots, in part due to the Bologna process with the streamlining and the formalization of university educations. But I think the topic that I'm presenting today really touches the core of some of the aspects of radical politics, which is how do we involve in democratic planning, in democratic participatory planning, and how do we make sure that our transition towards a more green future also draws upon people that are marginalized, the broader population, but also facilitates more collaborative aspects of problem solving that is inherent in the humankind and beyond. So I think it's really apt, since the journal is Territorial Politics and Governance, that we should talk about the aspect of planning, right? My presentation will essentially fall in two parts. The first part is to make the argument for co-creation and why we should resort to this concept relative to all coordinate concepts. But that's more of a conceptual quibble, which I don't think is the most important takeaway. And then the second aspect is my ongoing research project, in which I'm a part of. I'm a postdoctoral researcher. I'm involved in a larger project where we're trying to examine when does co-creation and the co-creation of green transition succeed. And in terms of planning, I think the most important thing is, first of all, to one, move beyond this more economy-centric perspective about the green transition, focusing on global value chains and production networks, which is indeed probably the most important thing, given that we live in a society that is governed by the principle of capital accumulation, but also look a little bit beyond that in terms of other aspects of sustainability in location and place-based politics, when people have issues with sanitation, when people have issues with trash and recycling, when people have issues with marginalization. How do we solve these problems from the perspective of civic society, also private actors, but as well as the public authorities? But beyond that, I think the important distinction to be made is that when we talk about planning, there is sometimes implicit assumption, or actually it's very, very explicit. We talk about planning from a technocratic perspective, right? We talk about planning as in, well, here is a body of geographers and planners who have ideas about how can we solve this urgent crisis that's coming in the future. We need to make very urgent steps, and that requires us to formulate policies that can facilitate this transition. When we talk about global value chains and production networks, there's also a similar idea that resourceful and powerful actors, corporate companies that have network centrality, have to create this change and create this impetus to bring about change. But the question about this technocratic perspective, this top-down perspective, or this hierarchical perspective is that very often it is not very collaborative. And when it is collaborative, it can be quite paternalistic or very superficial. So I think my point that I've been trying to make with the point about co-creation, and I'm going to elaborate upon what I mean exactly by co-creation, is that we need to move a little bit more away from planning that is centered around making big decisions on behalf of people, and instead bring people on board to make these decisions. And here I want to make a clear distinction. I'm not saying that we need to move necessarily from a top-down to a bottom-up perspective, right? Sometimes there's an assumption of bottom-up perspectives, especially in radical politics, that we need to circumvent public authorities because in part we can't trust them, they might be corrupt. Instead, the point is about creating these horizontal partnerships and how we can meaningfully collaborate across different sectors. And that is the emphasis of co-creation. So I'll start out then with the second question. How do we achieve a sustainable future that is democratically equitable? And why do we prioritize democratic planning? The tacit assumption that also goes into why we often are involved in technocratic planning is that democracy is not always equally efficient. And especially when this need for green transition is so urgent, we constantly hear that we need to make very radical changes. Sometimes we might think that the democratic process is not the most efficient way. Maybe we need some technocratic solutions that can see ahead and see much further than the average citizen to make those decisions, right? If we want a democratic process, we know it's very resource demanding. It takes time. The process can be protracted. There can be conflicts about different stakeholders because of the distributive consequences. Some people don't want to be involved in this process altogether. So there's a lot of perceived barriers. And that might also be why there's somewhat a paternalistic understanding very often about how do we create this green transition. And of course, this assumption is not meant in an ill intention, but that is one of the corollaries of the way in which we think about the urgency that is ahead and some of the dilemmas that enter the question, when we need to do something quickly, but we also need to do it democratically. So I think we need democratic solutions for the following reasons. The first reason I've said is this principle based on this Western liberal ideal, but I think this ideal also extends beyond it, is that human beings are sovereign individuals with the capacities of self-authorship and collective agency. And I think this normative principle needs to be anchored in all our decision-making at the very least. But what I also want to add is that there is actually a lot to be gained from mobilizing people from different sectors. And here, I mean, not only public-private partnerships, but in particular citizens who live in specific localities, so place-based politics, because they have more knowledge and experience with the transaction environment, right? They are living close to the transaction environment. And for that reason, there's a more opportunity to engage in a cross-fertilization of ideas. Therefore, this technocratic understanding that there's a division of labor between those who knows and lay people who don't know needs to be eroded to a high degree. The third point I want to make is that, well, there's the phenomenon of not in my backyard. Not in my backyard is a common issue when people all agree that we need to bring about changes to climate transition. But the problem about not in my backyard is that I don't want to have the windmill in my backyard. I don't want to have the solar panels that don't look very nice. But research and studies show that if people are involved in the process, they're more likely to have less implementation resistance, and you can mitigate the consequences and not in my backyard. Think about the yellow vests, right? Increasing oil prices and people feeling outraged about the fact that, well, it does harm people's daily lives. So we need to have more inclusion on that part. And then the fourth point is about mutual learning. We need to build repositories and reservoirs of knowledge in communities such that when we solve issues, we don't draw upon some generalized nomothetic understanding of the world based on positivistic understanding of the world. So we know that there's a lot of context-based politics that is important and context-based solutions when we solve local problems. One solution that works in Denmark does not necessarily work in India or in Indonesia or in South Africa. And we need to build knowledge and those capabilities by mobilizing people, creating a precedent, and also creating a tradition for citizen mobilization beyond our representative democracy. And by having that mutual learning within those communities, gradually we can also become more autonomous and make more decisions and make more solutions. And then the last issue is that when we are in the age of climate crisis, we need to address the issue that is known as wicked problems. There are more simple problems that we address that have a more linear solution. We can approach a more rationalist understanding, a means-end relationship between things. And then there are wicked problems that are inherently complex and difficult to solve. So usually when we have more top-down solutions, when authorities, they implement one solution to mitigate assumption one thing, we might see that people change and adjust their behavior, and then there are negative consequences that follow. And whether it's a rebound effect, for instance, Jevons paradox, for instance, then we realize, oh, it's not as simple as that. We cannot just impose a simple policy to mitigate consumption in one area to then solve it in another area. So on that note, co-creation. Well, co-creation is a concept that I'm trying to center my discussion about today. But as I said, it might in the very end be somewhat of a conceptual quibble, because that's not the most important takeaway from what I want to advance in my discussion. And that is essentially that co-creation, which is similar to concepts like co-production, collaborative governance, participatory planning, budgeting, and other coordinate concepts, tries to all center around the idea about involving citizens to a very high degree, but also partnerships and collaboration and horizontal relationships across different societal sectors, such as the public, private, and civic sector. And this has actually been foregrounded as one of the important agendas in the Sustainable Development Goals, right? The 17th and last SDG is about partnerships. And it's about the idea that we need to mobilize all facets of society, not only private organizations involved in production network, and not only the bureaucracy and the public authorities to solve those issues, but we need to leverage citizens in a meaningful way, not only for the symbolic reason to include people and let them sit at the table, but in the end, someone has already made the decisions, but we want to engage in more extensive forms of participation. And I think that is the definitional distinction. And I guess implicitly here is a normative implication of my definition. The idea that when I refer to co-creation, we want to refer to co-creation as instances in which public, private, and civic sector actors, in particular citizens, so not only NGOs, but still local citizens are involved, one, with the formulation and identification of local problems, 2, with the formulation and co-formulation of solutions to that problem, and 3, co-implementation of those solutions. And now this definition obviously is an ideal typical definition, right? In reality, we will often notice that this definition is hard to live up to. Actually existing co-creation might combine some of the elements, but not all 3 elements. But ideally, this is the standard towards which we should move. So for instance, we've noticed throughout the world, there's been a lot of austerity policies. And then as part of the austerity policies to reduce implementation resistance, you get the citizens on board, and then they can participate in choosing what to cut down the spending. That kind of collaborative governance is not strictly speaking as close to the ideals of co-creation because their participation is more tokenistic, the agenda is very fixed. So I think one way to think about it is to think about Marjorie Mayo's way of talking about empowerment, democratically speaking, right? She makes the distinction between there's the more participatory empowerment, which can be a little bit tokenistic very often. It can be a little bit superficial, and people invited to review and maybe make some comments on already made agenda. And then in the end, they then pass on that legislation. So people are informed about it. And they might even make some comments, and there's an element of participation, but it's relatively superficial because the agenda has already been set. Then there's the second form, which is a little bit better. That is also where you can expand agenda. So maybe an actor who initiates a collaborative governance project or co-creation project, they have some preset agenda. We want to solve a local problem, such as there's a lot of trash in a local area. How do we resolve that? And then they bring people on board, different stakeholders, but then they also allow them to expand beyond that agenda. What other things do we want to include as part of a solution? So that it involves a little bit more meaningful participation. And I think here we start to talk about co-creation, whereas the first part might not necessarily, strictly speaking, qualify as co-creation. And then we have the last form, which I believe is the more meaningful, most meaningful type of co-creation or participatory empowerment. And that is when you have also agenda changing, right? So when you actually enter the process, not only, well, there might be a preset agenda we want to discuss about a preset issue, but there's also a possibility to genuinely change the agenda. So it's not only about them either approving or not approving agenda, but also discuss about, well, is it really only about sanitation and cleaning up trash? Is it also about other societal issues or local issues that might be adjacent to it that we need to focus on first prior to those issues? And that also allows them to make genuine changes to the decision. So the two latter categories, that might be the aspects of co-creation I think is more important. So insofar as I have my background right now in a public management department, I think the one way to think about it is to transitionally think about it from the perspective of public governance paradigms. The traditional Weberian understanding of the relationship between the state and citizens is that the classical public management is to think about the citizen as a client, right? There's a division of labor, bureaucrats, they occupy specific positions based on their expertise, professional expertise. They deliver services, public services to clients as citizens. Then recently on the new liberalism, we moved towards a new public management paradigm where we see instead citizens as consumers. And that consumer-based perspective is that we have to optimize them and give them the best consumer experience, efficient outcomes, etc., through key performance indexes, competition between public and private authorities. But more recently, we moved on in some countries towards a more new public governance perspective. And that perspective then shifts the view of the citizen as not only a client or not only a customer, but also to a partner. And I think that shift is very important to promote co-creation as a policy agenda and to proliferate co-creation. Because now the idea is not only that the public and private and the civic sector are competing against each other, the idea is that you can collaborate across those different sectors. And through that collaboration, a lot of solutions can be made. So to that end, this is not a little bit unfortunate way of doing the color I could see. I've listed a few research agendas that I believe are important, and I'm going to present the last research agenda to wrap up the discussion about the current research project that I'm doing. I think one of the very important things that we need to look at is obviously the distributive justice elements, right? There's an element of justice when we involve people in co-creation, because research shows that if you're more resourceful, then obviously you would dominate the collaborative aspects of co-creation. How do we make sure and ensure that principles of justice are upheld. And I was attending, in fact, a presentation in the morning about just transition and the Bolster project from Tilbury University. And in fact, that also speaks to one of my research interests. But there's also the issue about who can initiate co-creation, because the traditional concept of co-production, which is the existing parallel, talks about co-production as the public sector involves citizens and maybe private actors to collectively produce a public service. But co-creation also suggests that it's not only the public sector that can initiate co-creation, but we can also look at it from the perspective of, well, the private companies initiating a project and then onboarding public sector actors, or we can look at civil society actors onboarding it and then bring about change. And I think another research agenda, which is the research agenda that I'm currently working on the governing the green transition project, which is about what constellation of governance factors are necessary and sufficient for successfully co-creating green transitions. And this is the final part of my presentation about this research project. My research project, where we involved, it's initiated at Roskilde University in 2022. Our research project was funded by the Danish Independent Research Council, who provided us with the funding to establish through 35 case studies around the world based on the same research protocol by testing a range of governance factors. And the idea is to then create, based on qualitative comparative analysis, to establish what governance factors are necessary or sufficient to successfully co-create green transitions. And that is an interesting, and here I'll just give you 3 small vignettes as I wrap up. And the first vignette is that we look at it from a private company. It's a Danish case study where we see that there's a private building housing foundation who's trying to create a very sustainable building, housing dormitory for craftsmanship students. And in that process, they say the reason for doing co-creation and why they've succeeded at doing co-creation is because they want to onboard people in the early stages instead of having an architect who imagines in their own mind how to create a sustainable building that is fitting to the future residents. That's usually what happens. The architect plans the idea, and then everyone else has to adjust according to those ideas. For instance, the artist, if they want to make art within. The second example is based on a case study in circular green blocks in Helsinki, and it is public sector initiated. And here we see in the instance of public authorities how they can promote green transition in terms of circular economy solutions, where they look at the interface between co-creation and end consumers, and also with service providers, where e-cargo bikes is the topic of the solution. And the idea is that when we have specific sharing and circular economy solutions that involves different citizens, we need to make sure that those solutions are not just imposed upon them top down, but we need to accommodate the interests and needs of people. And that has been a very successful way to listen to people and empower people and place those things in residential areas that also makes them feel that it's meaningful to participate. And then the very final example, as I wrap up, is based on a civic society example in Indonesia, which is a little bit different because the public sector is to a high degree characterized by corruption. But in this case, we see that with the mangrove conservation community, which has historically relied to a high degree on more top-down mechanisms and also market mechanisms, the shift towards horizontal forms of collaboration has been more successful. Just to put into perspective, mangrove conservation is a very urgent issue because it's a very important part of the blue ecosystem and for carbon sequestration. And what essentially we noticed is that in instances where we ran campaigns to mass mobilize people to plant mangrove saplings, only 10% of the saplings have survived because you just imposed on incentives. People go out and mass mobilize, plant 1 million saplings, and 90% die. But through collaborative governance and mutual learning in those communities, they've succeeded as one of the very few communities to restore a lot of the deforestation of the mangroves. On that very note, thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for exceeding a little bit the time.
Thank you very much for those incisive comments. So I'm just going to go straight to Virginie for the final comments as discussant. Colleagues, I hope you'll forgive me, but we are mindful of the time and your goodwill. So I think what we'll do is we'll just end with the discussant's comments, and then we'll tie this session together and we'll go into the final part. So please forgive me if we don't do Q&A. Thank you very much. And over to you, Virginie. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will stand here if it's okay with you. Good morning, everyone. And I'll try to be as quick as possible. Maybe I should skip the whole presentation because actually we heard about a wonderful lecture with a vision about where we should go, a compass for change, and then a great presentation at the local level, how it could be done in a more democratic way. Let me see. So what I was planning to do, and I was asked actually to comment on Janez's lecture more than the both talk, was to say a little bit about the bringing back natural resources to the front page, and then comment on this from the perspective of the journal, because this is the reason why I'm here as a co-editor of Territory Politics Governance, and offer some comments from my own disciplinary background, which is political geography, and a few questions that I think are linking also to the practice of and experiences of regional scholars. So the lecture was very rich, and I was fortunate enough to get the some PowerPoint in advance, so to look through the steps of the lecture. But I would like to focus really on the point of bringing the resources in the story to the front and the use of resources. So as Janez was telling us, is co-chair of this international resource panel launched by the UNEP already in 2007. And it's about building and sharing knowledge and at the interface of science and politics. First of all, for me as political geography, bringing back natural resources is a bit like I say open door, but I think it's a Dutchism. I mean, truism. We know that resources are so important, and what's new to it. But I think it's particularly important in the discussion about the transition and climate change responses and ecological transition as a kind of, I could say, a reality check. And you told us about the fridge, you told us about the electric cars. Indeed, this notion of replacing a whole float of cars in so few years is a huge consumption of research. What I had in mind was the line in the big project of MBS in Saudi Arabia, which is also framed in this idea of circular economy and so on. But when you look at the resources needed to build it, it's actually a huge resource grid project. And I think it's really resonate, of course, a lot with the material turn in social sciences, in spatial sciences, with the practice of many of yours and many of Regional Studies Association members, and obviously the topic of our conference today. As I said, coming from one of the many journals of the association, the one which is maybe the more involved with politics, with geopolitics sometimes. I look at this more specifically from that angle. And you see from the cover, we have each year a different picture for the cover of the journal. You see that actually much of it is about mobilization, citizenship, refugees, and so on, the pandemic twice. But the last cover, which was a response to the war in Ukraine, which was in the end to focus on resources and the importance of the war, the impact of war on food, not only on gas and so on, but also on food. So territory, I will be very basic and say with territory, politics, governance, there are entry points to look at these natural resources. So first, a territory is a national resource, land and water and food production for the settlement, for the mobility, biomass, but of course subterranean resources, the fossil fuels, the metallic and non-metallic minerals that are covered by the panel in these many reports. Yeah, I should stress that again. We saw a lot of slides with a lot of numbers, with a lot of statistics, but please go to the website and look for yourself. There are really a wealth of reports focusing on certain resources, focusing on certain users and so on. So the territory is a resource, but at the same time, territory is a way also to manage the resource, to claim resources. And so our thinking is very much shaped by territoriality and this notion of a modern territorial states as the most natural way to organize politics. So territorial claims on natural resources, this ownership of them, the exclusive use of certain natural resources, access, or sometimes protection, but most of the time it's about ownership and use. And there are a lot of processes of deterritorialization, but also reterritorialization involved. And one example is the notion of the exclusive economic zone for maritime resources that has been a kind of territorial expansion of the states into the sea with all the conflicts involved. Now in politics, what has struck me in all the discussion in the lecture is a lot of depoliticization of what is going on, but in a sense that it's a bit of a technocratic take. The conflicts seems to vanish a little bit on the background. And of course, there are a lot of conflicts between nations, but also between public and private actors, between classes, between generations, making claims on natural resources and the using. So politics is all about justifying and opposing certain way of exploiting them, extracting them, commodifying them, and circulating them. Politics is not only about interests and diverging interests and identities, but also on rights and duties, entitlements and responsibilities, and that could go back in time, forward in time, and so on. Nevertheless, in political geography, we have seen in peace studies, for example, there have been also discussion about political agendas, and Alexander was discussing this, also putting things on the agenda, of keeping them away from the agenda, very important, but also on reframing our thinking. We tend to see politics as agonism, as by definition it's about conflicts. And maybe we should think more about beyond conflict, alternative ways of achieving justice, equality, and so on. So there is an article by Barnett where we're actually focusing on the plausible geography of climate change, climate resilience, peace, instead of all the stories about all the wars that we can expect, or conflicts that we can expect from displaced people and so on. And governance is of course about moving beyond this frame of modern territorial states, the role of international organization, international regime, non-state actors. The picture is about the new treaty on the high seas. I think it's very important to stress that it is very different from the one on the UNCLOS on exclusive economic zone in this mining. And so we kind of attempt to govern the commons of natural resources in a different ways. So from a geographical perspective, or in a way of trying to comment on the lecture, I would like to look at how you think geographically about this compass from geopolitical perspective, and then urban and regional planning. And the first, what strikes me in the presentation is the methodological nationalism, this idea that countries and states as the taken for granted entities of all this accounting. And I know statistics and the states are linked, not only etymologically, but in the genealogy of the development of statistics. And I wouldn't, there is a lot of geographical sensitivity in the lecture about the differences between the global north and the global south, and sometimes some of the statistics between low income and high income countries. But I think we need really more subtle uneven geographies. So for example, Janez mentioned the fact that you have high consumers and low consumers in all countries. And it's one of these kind of statistics looking at the desires of, and I mean, the figures are very strong, but this geography should be even more fine grained, looking at regional differences within states, and representing more adequately the interdependencies, the multiscalar and the relational dynamics. So often, I think that when you look carefully about the consumption of the use of resources, it is not that easy to actually allocate it to a specific place, because there are all these interdependencies, and that people are on the move, but also some natural resources also are not so fixed as maybe expected. Then the geopolitics and natural resources. And then if you think classical geopolitics, that was all about the control of resources as an end and also as a mean for power. But in critical geopolitics, it's much more about the deconstruction of representations that justify all these claims, or that kind justifies. It includes also questioning key notions about what makes a resource and what is power and so on, questioning these key narratives, deconstructing vision. And I think the system change compass, as it has been presented to us, can be studied as a geopolitical discourse and can be problematized. So this complicated web of relations, because they foreground certain processes, but they background others, and that might be very important to do. Last is that a critique of critical geopolitics is always that it's critical, it deconstructs, but it doesn't provide alternative contributions. But there have been some attempts to do that and to stress how you could construct some alternative narratives based again on global commons, social justice, solidarity, and is inspired by different thinking. Then last, the urban and regional planning for sustainability. There is a very strong urban focus on the built environment, and I think it's justified because construction is really a very important sector, a user of resources. And think of, for example, cement production, huge. Also because we always say it's that the urbanization of the global population, and also cities as solution, and both as actors, but as sites also of where transition can take place or where change can take place. But even then, almost half of the global population still live outside cities. So how do these alternatives look like for more efficient use of resources when you're talking about sparsely populated region? The other issue, and Alexander already actually tackled that very much, covered that very much, is the problem of the top-down imposition of new ideas. And so the well-documented dangers also of high modernism, ignoring certain form of knowledge, local knowledge, traditional knowledge, but also the problem that can come from poor and hasty implementation of certain goals. Think of the lesson of the transition to organic farming in Sri Lanka is an example of that, where a lot of side effects and unexpected consequences. And again, planning for sustainability is maybe the core business, but is also planning for the transition and to make the transition as smooth as possible. And in general, I think in regional planning, it's also planning for the termination of extraction and livelihoods based on greed, accumulation, and so on. So it's really about developing new perspectives for groups and places that face radical transformation. If you look at mining communities in many countries in Western Europe, you'd see that they are 50 years later, they are still, most of them are still struggling with that. So this is more about local knowledge with the wind catchers. More question, and I hope I have time to go through that. One of the things I was wondering was when you look at the statistics presented and how they are presented, is that some big users are a bit hidden. They are not really on the front. Digitalization, for example. And when I try to think of, human needs, fundamental human needs, the digitalization has brought a huge amount of things that we now think we need. that we didn't need 30 years ago, and that consume a lot of resources. And so sometimes there is some kind of, in conversation, you see a kind of generational blind spot. People a bit older than me cannot imagine a meal without meat. And maybe people a bit younger than me cannot imagine not going to visit cities a few times a year and to go on holiday, to take the plane for holidays all the time. And younger people, they cannot imagine life without ChatGPT and TikTok, not realizing that the amount of resource needed can be quite huge. Tourism is another one I missed. I suppose it's on the mobility, but it's a very different kind of human needs than the mobility you need to in daily life. And it consumes a lot of resources, both also construction and mobility and so on. And again, we could wonder about alternative non-commodified forms of traveling. Then I have a set of questions that are more about the offered framework. Is sustainable and responsible use of resources enough? Is there such a thing as responsible extractivism? So can you have a mind that is actually sustainable? And I think here we could benefit a lot for engaging with other forms of, with other ontologies and epistemologies, especially in South America. You see where they have been a lot of mobilization against mining and extractivism. You can see some ideas to how to think about this. And is systematic change possible without changing the fundamentals of the system? So decoupling, but in a system where the pervasiveness of growth thinking is still there. And I didn't hear the term degrowth. At some point you say capital, you mention capitalist system, but it's a bit downplayed, I believe. So maybe if you have to, yes, please. Yeah. And then finally, the implementation, and that was actually covered by Alexander's lecture too, how to people the vision. And it's a very technocratic language and metrics. And I was wondering, is it a technocratic vision or is it a technocratic packaging for advocacy purposes? Because you try to convince the policymakers at the international level or at the national level. And if you do so, could it be counterproductive because it might reach them, but doesn't reach people, it doesn't inspire people, or they feel that they will be forced to do things. So how to engage with the multitude of bottom-up mobilization, and how to use the compass, and so the danger of appointing people that are expert compass using. How could you have this inspiring principle being inspiring and not imposing? So it's linked to the crisis of deliberative processes, crisis of democracy. I would add also the social media bubbles in which people are caught, and Alexander again was suggesting avenues to go further. I wanted to end with a plea for regional answers. And so, because I think there is so much expertise at this conference to actually ask more questions from the perspective of the region on the production, circulation, the processing, the consumption of resources, but also from these regional practices, local knowledges of human needs to improve learning process. The feedback also flows that we can have when some alternative process is created. And so to stress the importance of context-specific answers to the transition dilemma, which is, I think, basically your fridge story or the electric car story, the new that can be maybe much higher standard of efficiency, resource efficiency also, but replacing the old before it is actually broken, is costing a lot of resources, or keeping the old and trying to improve it, but maybe having a suboptimal kind of sufficiency. That is, I think, a dilemma, a problem that we encounter all the time, and that can only be answered at the local or the regional level. Thank you very much for the very talk and for your attention.
Thank you very much also to Virginie for wrapping up the session. Colleagues, I'm very conscious our wonderful session that's been action-packed has run beyond our allotted time. So what I'm going to suggest is actually, because I think this has been so rich, is we will organize a TPG webinar on this so we can pick up some of these things and invite you to come back and join us and ask those questions and pick up the provocations that I think Virginie has left us. And I know in an ideal world, our two speakers would be so eager to come back at and to respond to. But I think if you'll forgive me, that's what we will do as a commitment. We'll pick up it in a webinar, and we'll make sure this conversation continues, because it really has been a joy to listen to. So thank you again to speakers and discussants. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sally to wrap us up. Thank you, Sally.
Hello, thank you very much again to our speakers. That was a really wonderful closing for the conference. Neil Lee, the new chairman of the RSA, has had to leave, but I've asked Klaus if he will deputise, and we're just going to keep you for 2 or 3 minutes. It's an opportunity to say thank you to the people that have given us this really inspiring and enjoyable few days. So Klaus, could I ask you to do the honours for the RSA board, please?
Well, it's a great pleasure. I'm back again within 30 seconds. Just get time to catch my breath and to do the really, really important work when you've really had an excellent conference. And I hope you've all enjoyed your time here. And it is really important that I do offer the thanks to all those who need to be thanked. So it's a bit of a list, but it's an important list. So first of all, sincere thanks, of course, to Neil for being chair. And I'm sorry he couldn't be with us, but clearly being chair of any conference is really important in setting the sort of shape and style and the content. Secondly, I think it's really, really important to thank you for attending. It's great to be back for an in-person event. I salute the RSA for the digital work that they did, the e-festivals, but I was there for the dinner last night. I saw the joy on so many of your faces to be connecting with both old and new colleagues. And I think there's something to be said for all of that, notwithstanding the comments about sustainability. It's really difficult to reconcile, but being back in person is what we do, I think, as academics. Thirdly, I think it's really important to say that we are a community. So I hope most of you, if not all of you, already RSA members, but please do consider it if you are not. It's a wonderful association to be part of. I'm a comparative interloper. I've only been part of it for about 6 or 7 years. I was talking to a gentleman yesterday who's been part of it about 25 years. So, you know, I've been put in my place in terms of membership. A couple other things to finish off on. I think it's extraordinarily important that we thank our local hosts. I just can't pay tribute enough to everybody here in Ljubljana, beautiful Ljubljana, who has really made this possible. It's been utterly seamless. Even things like the audio-visual element of this has just been phenomenal. I can't always say that'd be the case back in the UK. So huge, huge tribute and thanks to all the help that we've received. Thank you, as always, to the wonderful RSA team. They know who they are, often wearing particularly distinctive pink t-shirts. They are incredible. And ladies and gentlemen, it would not be possible to edit the journal without all the extraordinary support as well that we all receive as journal editors. Now, let me finish on one final thing. I certainly don't need my notes here, because I can't possibly let it go without saying something. And that it obviously revolves around our wonderful chief executive. As many of you will know, Sally is stepping down in terms of her role as chief executive after an incredible 37 years being part of this association. I just want to highlight 3 things, and this is when I will finish. Number 1, I think it's difficult to imagine the RSA without Sally. That's going to be quite a challenge in terms of what that looks and feels like. But certainly, I don't think anybody can underestimate the extraordinary energy, enthusiasm, and commitment to running the RSA that she is utterly personified. I think the second thing that Sally has championed so brilliantly during her tenureship as chief exec in particular is her commitment actually to accessibility, to engagement, to empowerment. And that means, for example, taking seriously those who are still underrepresented within our academic and professional communities. And that means also, I think, in a sense, taking very seriously the importance of networking and support and those kinds of things. So I salute Sally for that. And then finally, I think Sally's unrelenting commitment to academic scholarship, to mutual learning, and also just simply to publishing. You know, it is an extraordinary testimony that under her tenure, we have had so many amazing journals and publications that have, in a sense, flourished under her direction and her enthusiasm. We would not have territory politics governance, for example, without her forethought and her support for previous editors who came before me. So I want to end on that note of huge, huge thanks and appreciation to our extraordinary chief executive. Thank you very much.
Well, had to be said, had to be said.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I am a little bit undone by that. That was an unscheduled and unadvertised tribute. Thank you, Klaus. I really do appreciate it. I can tell you that I have had a blessed career. This community is distinctive, I think, in 2 real ways. Firstly, it's multidisciplinary. Secondly, it's international. When I hear my CEO colleagues at our various forums talking about what happens on their board, what happens at their conferences, I don't really have many points of connection because I don't recognize the petty jealousies, the little put downs. What I see is the Women's Network, which works on a WhatsApp group operated by the women themselves. It was a bottom-up initiative. I see the people that are in the territorial ambassadors working within their communities. I see the people that are doing the research grants that are then publishing and bringing more people into the community. I actually see all of you as supervisors working with your PhD students, encouraging them into the network. And I think that makes you really the reason why I have had such a fun almost 4 decades. So I thank you for that. I want to finish the conference by giving the final word to our 2 amazing local organisers, not forgetting Peter Vosner, my good cycling friend. But let me pass to Sonia and to Vasya. They've organised this conference 2 or 3 times because of COVID, and that is beyond the call of duty. Vasya.
Thank you, Sally. I'll be very short because we are already going into overtime. But what I want to say, because I'm more of a finance guy, and you know, the finance conferences are all, you know, very up and tight. I really enjoyed the spirit of all of you in this conference. I think it's all of you taken together that is really the testament to why the RSA banner is so successfully being carried forward over all these years. I want to thank you for the wonderful 4 days that we had together. I hope you enjoyed it as well, both the science-based and the networking-based part of it. We heard some very wonderful discussions over the plenaries that we had, some really thought-provoking also challenges that we're all facing, that the regions are facing because of all the transformations that are happening. But this event has also been, a very important networking event. So I hope that the reception that we had at the castle, the dinner that we had yesterday, made everyone feel at home in Ljubljana, everyone feel at ease, that you also enjoyed the side events and side trips that RSA organized. And I think we had an excellent example here of trans-regional cooperation between the UK and Slovenia. So I also want to thank on this occasion, both to our local team as well as to the RSA team. There are many, many people, and since we're going over time, I will not go into each and every details, but each of them played their very important part, from, all of you guys at RSA, to Barbara, the IT guys who helped all these seamless transmissions that you saw, to our student helpers, to the caterers, to the cleaning ladies, after all, because remember, we need to keep the facilities clean. So I hope you all had really a wonderful experience. And we set the bar high after COVID, but with these spirits, you can only go higher. So I wish all the luck and all success with the next year conference in Florence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, don't forget Florence next year, being another amazing conference. Thank you all for coming. We hope you've had a great time. We hope you have a safe trip home. Have fun for the rest of your time in Ljubljana. Thank you very much. Thank you.